Alright, welcome back. We are now at the tail end of Chapter 2. Last time we covered the true infinite. Now we're going to read the transition and the final remarks on this chapter. So, Josh, we're at page 120. Let me know if you're there. Okay, transition. Ideality can be called the quality of the infinite, but it is essentially the process of becoming, and hence transition. A transition. Like the transition of becoming into existence, we must now explicate this transition, this imminent turning back as the sublating of finitude, that is, of finitude as such, and equally as a negative finitude that only stands opposite to it, is only negative finitude, is self-reference, being. Since there is negation in this being, the latter is existence. But further, since negation is essentially negation of the negation, self-referring negation, it is the existence that carries the name of being for itself. Pretty clear, right?
Yep.
Well, wrong.
That it's clear?
Obviously. Okay, so I'm just going to reread it more slowly. He said, ideality can be called the quality of the infinite. So if you remember back to last time, he does mention this, that the finitude and infinitude are both ideal in a way. I remember what he said about the ideality of the finite, in that literally the finite is for him a figment, like sort of in the sense of a figment. The finite does not actually exist for itself. It's not the true reality, and as such, it's taking it to be the true reality is a fiction of our minds. It's ideal in that sense. But I don't quite remember. I'm not quite sure what ideality has to do with the infinite here.
Oh, it's
Or rather, is it because
we think of the infinite as the ideal?
Yeah, there's that sense too. So I think he means it that way. But he's also meaning it in a very technical sense. I think, like also in the figment sense, in that the existence of the infinite is the finite.
Yeah.
So since the finite would be the quality of the infinite, ideality is the quality of the infinite. So I think it's there in that sense. And he probably also means it in like the far, far away sense of like what he will talk about is the idea later on. But it is essentially the process of becoming, and hence a transition, like the transition of becoming into existence. That is because the true infinite is the process of self-sublation or self-transcendence of the finite. So being that it is a process, it has to be a process that comes from and leads to something. We must now explicate this transition, this imminent turning back as a sublating of finitude that is a finitude as such, and equally the negative finitude that only stands opposite to it is only negative finitude. So infinitude, he says, is only negative finitude. This process of self-sublation is negative finitude. Rather, it's the relation of the finitude, the negative, is self-reference being. It's always good to keep in mind that the way being is this immediate. It's also returns to being in self-reference, positive affirmation. Since there is negation in this being, the latter is existence. We already know that. But further, since the negation is essentially negation of the negation, self-referring negation, it is the existence that carries the name of being for itself. So I like that he just reiterates that important point, that the negation is affirmation, self-referring negation, it is existence, it is being, and it is also negative finitude, it's the negative, and it also points out, how constantly and consistently the way things are shown to develop is only when we look at them in their pure negative side. And only then do we see the full movement of things. From their immediate positivity, we get fooled into believing that things just are. Alright, remark 1. The infinite, in the usual sense of the bad infinite, and the progression to infinity, such as the ought, are the expression of a contradiction that pretends to be itself a solution and an ultimate. This infinite is a first elevation of sense, representation above the finite to thought, but to a thought which, for content, has only a nothing, that is, a non-existent, explicitly posited as such. It is a flight beyond restrictions that fails to gather itself together within and is unable to bring the negative back to the positive. So, that's a really great point there, in which, he's recalling everything we've done up to now and reinterpreting it according to what we have developed further. It's that moment of recollection in which, now what originally, had we said at the beginning, would have been external reflection. Now we can legitimately reflect these things as immanent because we know they are actually pertinent to what originally begins this whole inquiry, and that they actually do connect. So, here, he says, this infinite is a first elevation of sense representation above the finite to thought. So it's the pure process of abstraction that leads us to pure being, which in metaphysical theology had considered to be, God, a pure, infinite being. A thought which, for content, has only a nothing, that is, a non-existent, explicitly posited as such. So, being is nothing, or, in the Heideggerian sense, being is no thing, so being itself doesn't exist as a being, can't be cognized as one, can't be experienced as one, so it becomes, really weird to be talking about it all, if this is the case. So something that doesn't exist nonetheless is said to be the reality of existence. It is a flight beyond the restrictions that fails to gather itself together within and is unable to bring the negative back to the positive. So in being this pure, unbounded, and infinite with no restrictions, there's nothing that can be thought or experienced of it. So it fails to gather itself together within and is unable to bring the negative back to the positive. This unfulfilled reflection has before it both the determinations of the true infinite, namely the opposition of the finite in the infinite and the unity of the finite in the infinite, but fails to bring the two thoughts together. The thought of one unavoidably brings the other along, but this reflection lets them only alternate. So then this recalls back to what he said prior in this section of the infinite and finite, in which the infinite is posited by common understanding as true being, infinite being, pure being, and the finite is the non-being, the nothing. And they are supposed to be completely and utterly distinct. In the unity of name the opposite, but fails to bring the two thoughts together. The thought of one unavoidably brings the other along, but this reflection lets them only alternate. So the alternation between the finite and the infinite is exactly what explains why the alternation, or gives one possible explanation, or rather at least is one certain explanation that we have so far as to why the shift from being to nothing happens, why the alternation is possible in a way, or rather it explains in more detail how this occurs. At least that's how I'm understanding this. The spectacle of this alternation, this infinite progression, occurs wherever one remains fixated on the contradiction of the unity of two determinations and of their opposition. The finite is the sublation of itself. It holds its negation, the infinity in itself. Unity of the two. It is the movement beyond the finite into the infinite as the beyond of the finite. Separation of the two. But over and beyond the infinite, there is another finite. The beyond, the infinite, holds finitude. Unity of the two. But this finite is also a negative of the infinite. Separation of the two, and so forth. Thus, in the relation of causality, cause and effect are inseparable. A cause that would have no effect is not a cause, just as an effect that had no cause would no longer be effect. This relation yields, therefore, the infinite progression of causes and effects. Something is determined as cause, but as something finite, and it is finite just because of its separation from the effect. It has itself a cause, that is, it is also effect. Consequently, the same thing that was determined as cause is also determined as effect. Unity of cause and effect. What is now determined as effect has in turn a cause, that is, the cause is to be separated from its effect and to be posited as a different something. This new cause is, however, itself only an effect. Unity of cause and effect. It has an other for its cause, separation of the two determinations, and so forth, into infinity. That's pretty great, I think. That's like a really great example of just like, you thought this didn't apply to anything. Well, here you go. Like literally there we saw the applications of being and nothing becoming, applications of existence, the applications of something and other, the application of finitude and infinitude to something which we all know as just common mundane nowadays, which is the idea of cause and effect. Causality, efficient causality, and also the in philosophy, the rational version, which is the principle of sufficient reason. Why is it that they don't have, that we don't find an ultimate cause? Causeless cause can't make sense, doesn't make sense. It's why people, this is why people, in Philosophy 101 classes, you have the cosmological arguments for, the existence of God, for example. And, you have Aquinas' like 5 different arguments, and, they go, it's like, well, if everything has a cause, then it's an endless chain of causes and effects, but this has to be terminated somewhere. Something has to be the ultimate cause of all causes, a causeless cause, and that is God. And what is the rebuttal which, the typical philosopher and atheist gives? It's like, well,
what caused that?
Yeah, what causes the uncaused cause? Why is it that you can have a cause that doesn't have a cause? What's the explanation there? And, they have nothing to say other than like, look, man, it wouldn't make sense if it just goes on forever. And the alternate argument is, well, it doesn't make sense if you just arbitrarily stop it and say, well, it's God.
But it must. Because there's something here, and we don't know what caused it.
Yep. So I mean, all that shows is, and Hegel is showing here, cause can't be the ultimate explanation. So if there is an explanation for this infinite chain of causes, it can't be within the causal chain itself. It has to be something else grounding cause and effect. Something else explaining it. So that's interesting. Continuing. We can thus restate the progression in this more appropriate form. The claim is made that the finite and the infinite are one unity. This is a false claim that needs correction by its opposite. The two are absolutely different and opposed. This claim is in turn to be corrected to the effect that the two are inseparable, that in the one determination there lies the other by virtue of the claim to unity, and so forth to infinity. It is easy enough to see in the nature of the infinite. One must recognize, to see into the nature of the infinite, one must recognize that the infinite progression, the developed infinity of the understanding, is constituted by the alternation of the two determinations of the unity and the separation of the two moments, and then therefore recognize that this unity and this separation are inseparable. So this is a return, harkens back to the stuff on chapter 1 on the, I think, remark 2, the speculative proposition, where he says, it's that we can't say the kinds of things which he wants to say in one go, because it's just impossible. You have to say thing the way you could say it, but the proposition itself won't say what you intend. So you say being and nothing are one and the same, and he spends I think 2 pages or so just explaining how, yes, this is true, but this has to be understood in the dual sense of it is both true and not true. It's true that they're the same. It's true that they're not. It's true that they are the same and they're not. And therefore, this is the unity of the separation, or the what did he call it? The inseparability of separation and inseparation. And so this what is that meme? you know what meme I'm talking about, where they show it's a picture, and it's usually say something like Marxist Capital, and and they're this fries the analytics brain, or this fries the economist brain, because they can't comprehend it, because it just seems so contradictory to them. They just don't get it.
Oh yeah.
And they respond with "But please." But my definitions. It's basically what happens here. Like I can totally see how someone just would find this to be nonsense if they hadn't thought along with this the entire way and seen that how this happens, so that they know what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Continuing. The resolution of this contradiction is not the acknowledgement of the equal correctness and of the equal incorrectness of both claims. This would only be another shape of the still abiding contradiction, but the ideality of both, in the sense that in their distinction as reciprocal negations, they are only moments. So that sheds some light on what he means by ideality. That monotonous alternation of the infinite progression is in fact the negation of both their unity and their separation. What was demonstrated above is just as much present in it de facto, namely, that the finite, over and beyond itself, falls into the infinite, but that, over and beyond this infinite, it equally finds itself born anew, hence that it rejoins itself there, as is also the case for the infinite, so that this same negation of negation results in affirmation, a result that thereby provides itself to be their truth and point of origin. In this being, which is thus the ideality of the distinct moments, the contradiction has not vanished abstractly, but is resolved and reconciled, and the thoughts, while left intact, are also brought together. So, this is important, I think, and I'll definitely save this. Because this is one thing in which I myself haven't done enough, and I think Hegelians in general don't do enough. People talk about, well, Hegel accepts contradictions. And, for Hegel, everything is contradictory. But the truth of the fact is, they're only contradictions for the understanding. For Hegel's point of view, once we've thought these things through, it's not a contradiction at all. It's literally just what he says. It's moments of an actual single absolute concept. There is no, logical contradiction in the normal sense of, this doesn't make sense. It's like affirming the same thing at the same time. It's just showing, look, if you think one thing, it's going to lead to the other, and it leads back again. It's because they're intrinsically tied. They're moments of the exact same absolute. They're both there, but it's not this barefaced contradiction which doesn't make sense. It's not the abstract contradiction which, Eastern philosophy has. I've yet to see anything of the likes which is Hegelian contradiction in the sense of Hegelian contradiction. People say, well, there's a Eastside dialectical thinking too. Yeah, they accepted contradiction, but they accepted barefaced contradiction. They didn't explain it, whereas Hegel explains it and shows contradiction to not in fact be contradictory at all. It's just literally just the way the thinking works. It's the way this thought develops. Yeah, it's moments. They're not absolutes, so there's no contradiction whatsoever. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Did Plato understand contradiction in his dialectics the way Hegel did? Can't answer that because I have yet to read I have a list because I got it from one of the other Hegel channels of someone that's named the dialogues in which he says Plato finally, near the end of his life, formulates.
You're cutting out a lot.
A dialectical method. Sorry about that. Don't know what else to do about that. It's my crappy internet. Which I don't know why it's crappy, but blame my laptop. What I was saying, if hopefully this doesn't cut out, that there are certain dialogues in Plato which apparently he does formulate an explicit theory of dialectics. I don't know if his is very much in line with Hegel. Apparently it is, but obviously it isn't. It can't exactly be Hegel's. I've actually read the usual Plato. I read the Republic. But I read it at a time in which I frankly didn't care, and so I just read through it, didn't really think about it much. It was during my Marxist phase in which I was done with idealism.
But you're never truly done. You came back.
So Hold on. So yeah, I don't know. I want to read those dialogues. Tree didn't say whether he would or would not today. So we'll see. Alright, sorry. Fat dog wanted to go inside. So anyways, I think the big point to take from that is that fetishizing contradiction a bit too much is a bit off, because Hegel sees himself, at least from what I understand here, to be explain the contradiction. If you explain the contradiction, it's not a contradiction in the form that people think the logical contradictions are anymore. So the contradiction is preserved in that, they are opposed in that sense of contradiction, but they're not absolutely opposed, and therefore they're not really a contradiction in the sense of a bare claim of, say, A is and is not A. But let's keep going now. Here we have, in a graphic example, the nature of speculative thought displayed in its determining feature. It consists solely in grasping the opposed moments in their unity, inasmuch as each moment shows, as a matter of fact, that it has its opposite in it, and that in this opposite it rejoins itself. The affirmative truth is this internally self-moving unity, the grasping together of both thoughts, their infinity, the reference to oneself, which is not immediate, but infinite. That's an important one. That's a sort of definition of speculative thought. I'll definitely be using that one. Alright, care to read on, Hyperion?
Yeah, let's read on.
Do what?
Oh, you want me to read?
Yeah, I said if you want to read on.
I don't know, not right now.
Alright. Continuing, the essence of philosophy has often been located by those already adept in the things of thought in the task of answering the question: how does the infinite go forth out of itself and come to finitude? This, as opinion would have it, escapes conceptual comprehension. Emphasis on conceptual comprehension. In the course of this exposition, the infinite at whose concept we have arrived will further determine itself as the desideratum, how the infinite, if one can so express oneself, comes to finitude, will be manifested in it in the full manifold of forms. Here we are considering this question only in its immediacy and in view of the just mentioned sense which the infinite usually carries. So here it seems to me like the way things are to be thought from here on is all going to be in the form, is now going to follow the forms of the infinite. Everything has already followed the forms of the infinite, but now it's explicit. Now we know it, and we know exactly, why this is possible. So whereas, with the transitions of being and nothing, it just happened. We just notice it happens, and we notice it happens inevitably and immediately. We couldn't explain why it happened. Then with becoming, the same thing. It just happens. Existence, same thing. It just happens. with something another, it starts getting a bit more explainable. We now start seeing, a bit more of why this is possible, but not quite yet. And then finally, with the infinite, now we know that the movement of self-transcendence is what explains this movement that has gone on before us. I don't know. At least that's what it seems to me. Does it seem like that to you?
Yeah, that's how I was taking it too.
So to speak of, everything that's going to follow, or even stuff that has preceded this, as the unfolding of the infinite, the self-determination of the infinite, seems fitting. At least if we wanted to see it that way. Part of me thinks you can see it this way, but at the same time, it's sort of a mistake to see it this way. Like in my recent blogs, I've been talking. I've had like this fascination with noticing the way that reflection works with terms, and I mention a lot the being of being and yada yada yada. And while you can do this, it's also a way of mistaking it, in which it seems that that if one does that, one then mistakes the logic as being this sort of like emanation, like unfolding of the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I don't think Hegel really intends that, because the beginning, like he makes a lot of mentions about how these beginning concepts are just poor, and how and he'll say things later which I haven't yet directly read, but they're in the texts. For example, he mentions in the Logic of Essence that being and nothing are nothing but fictions, of an abstraction that went on already from the standpoint of essence. So, does it then make sense to be talking about, this entire movement of the logic, as the unfolding of being? Well, no. If you're going to say that being and nothing were actually fictions from the standpoint of essence, then it really can't be the unfolding of being. It can't be that Hegel really is trying here to penetrate into the mystery of being. He just probably doesn't really care. He could care less about being as such. Being is just a poor category. So to speak of the rest of this as the unfolding of the infinite also seems to me, to probably be putting too much emphasis on certain things.
Yeah, maybe.
Continuing. It is above all on the answer to this question that whether there is a philosophy is taken to depend, and people believe, while still professing willingness to let the matter rest on it, that they also possess in the question itself a sort of puzzle and an invincible talisman that firmly secures them against the answer, and consequently against philosophy in the attainment of it. In order to understand questions, a certain education is required also in other subject matters, and this is all the more the case for things philosophical if more of an answer is to be had than that the question is an idle one. It is fair to expect in these questions, as is normally done, that the point at issue would not depend on words, but would rather be made intelligible through some form or other of expression. Figurative expressions of sense representation that are used in the question regarding the infinite, like going forth and such like, arouse the suspicion that the question stems from this terrain of vulgar representation, and that the answer is also expected to be in representations current in everyday life and in the shape of a sensuous simile. So that's a good critique, I think, that to begin philosophy from the standpoint in which you already assume that the answer is just not possible. That you want to have a philosophy of the world, but say, but ultimately, God is so great it's beyond our comprehension. Well, that's BS. That's a cop out. And likewise, it's just weird to have a philosophy in which you're going to say, well, the being of beings, it's not itself a being, and being is not a thing; it's a no thing. So you can never really directly access it through intellect. There has to be some sort of intuitive gap. Yada yada yada. Not that I know anything about Heidegger, so I'm just bullshitting here, but but that's what it seems to me a lot of the time. So stuff like that, bad philosophy. Continuing, take being in general instead of the infinite. The determining of it, its having a negation or finitude in it, seems easier to comprehend. Being is indeed the indeterminate, but it is not immediately said in it that it is the opposite of anything determinate. The infinite, on the contrary, contains this note expressly. It is the non-finite. The unity of the finite and the infinite thus appears excluded from the start. The incomplete reflection is most stubbornly opposed to this unity for precisely this reason. But it has been shown, and it is immediately evident without expanding further on the determination of the finite and the infinite, that the infinite, in the sense in which it is taken by the incomplete reflection, namely as standing opposite the finite, has its other in it precisely because it stands opposed to it, and is therefore already limited and itself finite. It is the bad infinite. The answer to the question, how does the infinite become finite, is therefore this: there is not an infinite which is infinite beforehand, and only afterwards does it find it necessary to become finite, to go forth into finitude. The infinite is rather for itself just as much finite as infinite, inasmuch as the question assumes that the infinite is by itself on the one side, and the finite which has gone forth from it, and from wherever it might have come, into the divide, is truly real, as thus separated from the infinite. One should say rather that it is this divide which is conceptually incomprehensible. Neither such a finite nor such an infinite has truth. That which has no truth, however, cannot be conceptually grasped. Yet it must be granted that they are conceptually comprehensible. To consider them even as they are in representation with the determination of each implicit in the other, to have a simple insight into this inseparability which is theirs, means that we comprehend them conceptually. This inseparability is their concept. In the self-subsistence of that infinite and finite, the question sets up a false content instead. It presupposes a false connection between them. For this reason, the question is not to be answered, but the false presuppositions contained in it, in effect, the question itself, or rather to be denied. By thus questioning the truth of such finite and infinite, the standpoint is altered, and this change will turn the embarrassment with the question, which the question was supposed to cause, back on the question itself, to the reflection from which the question originated. Our own question is something new, for that reflection lacks the speculative interest that would lead it to ascertain for its own sake, and before it draws connections between determinations, whether such determinations are anything true as presupposed. To the extent, however, that the untruth of that abstract infinite is recognized, and of the finite which is equally supposed to stand unmoved on its side, there is this to be said of the procession of the finite out of the infinite. The infinite goes out of itself into the finite because, in the way it is grasped as abstract unity, it has no truth in it, no standing, and conversely, the finite goes forth into the infinite for the same reason. Or it is rather to be said that the infinite proceeded to finitude from all eternity, that is, just as much as pure being, it absolutely is not by itself alone without having its other in it. So, I think that's just a fine paragraph that just goes to show bad presuppositions, bad questions, and bad answers. So, anytime you have a question in which you have the question, how is this possible? And the assumption is that somehow something and other are completely disconnected. The question has to be, well, a bad question. It's a wrong question because it has a wrong presupposition. The idea that things are separate, completely and absolutely separate, is just false. And I like that Hegel here says, anything that is truly false is literally unthinkable. That is, within any time that we are speaking of a falsehood, we really have to have some element of truth there. This actually recalls something that Parmenides says. Parmenides says, is somewhere in the poem on nature, that it is literally impossible to think falsehood because falsehood is not. And in the very utterance of words, in the very thinking of thought, you at least think, or at least are enacting being. And so in as much as you do that, you have at least that much truth.
Yep.
So whether you think that you spoke a falsehood, that falsehood could only be on a degree of error in as much as you've spoken being. So falsehood for Hegel is also just that much. It's a degree of error insofar as you have a degree of truth. So falsehood is just literally an incomplete truth.
Yeah. Parmenides was such a great thinker.
I still gotta finish up my blog on that, because it is a pretty damn good piece. Like the poem on the fragment on nature. Yeah, Parmenides is a pre-Socratic. One of the most important pre-Socratics. I mean, pretty much everybody
Yeah.
I forget who was first. Apparently, I don't know if it was Parmenides first and then Heraclitus, or Heraclitus first, Parmenides, or they were contemporaries or something.
I think Heraclitus was first, but I'm not sure.
So, all right. Oh, and I think another important point here is Hegel's pointing out there is no beginning. It was the way he said it. He says, to the extent, however, that the untruth of that abstract infinite is recognized, and of the finite which is equally supposed to stand unmoved on its side, there is to be said of the procession of the finite out of the infinite. The infinite goes out of itself into the finite because, in the way it is grasped as abstract unity, it has no truth in it, no standing. And conversely, the finite goes forth into the infinite for the same reason. Or it is rather to be said that the infinite proceeded to finitude from all eternity. That is, that just as much as pure being, it absolutely is not by itself alone without having its other in it. So it's not that the finite preceded the infinite, or the infinite the finite. From the standpoint of eternity, which here just means the non-temporal, logical standpoint, they both have to immediately be there from the very beginning. There can be no actual beginning in one or the other. They both presuppose the other immediately. They both are there in the very same moment. So this is a refutation, I think, a very strong refutation of anybody who thinks that in Hegel anything actually precedes anything. Because logically speaking, no, there is no preceding of this kind. At least not here and not yet. Once you get to temporality, you have a temporal procession, but logically speaking, so far These things are there already, and we grasp their truth as these unities, which they really are. The truth of being a nothing is this ablation which is becoming. And that is the actual absolute form of being a nothing. Likewise, existence, the absolute form of becoming, the infinite being the absolute form of existence. Yada, yada, yada. So, things have always already existed in the absolute form. There is no priorness or in these developments. Or rather, priority. At least as I'm understanding it so far.
Yeah, necessary priority.
So, continuing.
I can read if you want.
I'll continue.
Mm-hmm.
The question, how the infinite proceeds to the finite, can harbor further presupposition still, namely that the infinite includes the finite within itself, and consequently that it is the unity of itself and its other, so that the difficulty has to do essentially with the separating, for this is in opposition to the presupposed unity. On this presupposition, the opposition insisted upon only assumes a different form. The unity in the distinguishing are separated from each other and held isolated. If, however, the unity is not taken abstractly and indeterminately, but rather, as in the presupposition, as the determinate unity of the finite in the infinite, the distinguishing of these two is also present in it. And this distinguishing is not one that would also let them go loose, each subsisting separately, but it rather leaves them in the unity of as idealized. This unity of the infinite and the finite, in the distinguishing of them, are inseparable in the same way as the finite in the infinite. So what I understand that is, it's the inverse form. So if the first presupposition is the error of absolute distinction, the second presupposition's error is the error of absolute unity. At least absolute abstract unity. Just as in the first one, it's the absolute abstract distinction. Because here it's the unity is taken as the bad infinite, so to say, the beyond of the finite, in which the finite is just the absolute negative. It doesn't actually exist. It's a nothing. It's just a figment. It and it alone is ideal. Well, for Hegel, both the moments of the finite as the restricted and the ought, the beyond, are finite. They're both ideal. And so it's the unity of this unity and disunity that is the real unity, so to say, or the absolute unity. Which also, I don't know, this is part of what makes me question people who say look, Hegel's a monist, and I see why they want to say it, but it's also very clear that it's just not true in the way they say it. Yes, there is an ultimate unity, but this unity is just a very strange thing to say. Because once you know what he means, yes, it makes sense, but the way it's said is misleading in the way because he doesn't mean this Parmenidean absolute unity of static unity or something.
Yeah.
Difference is real. As opposed to people who keep saying, oh, Hegel just reduces everything to this final ultimate unity. What are you talking about? The unity is only a unity because there really is a difference.
Yeah. It's a unity of difference, a multiplicity.
So it's not that the unity is more real or the difference is more real. They're both equal. They have an equal weight in the consideration.
Mm-hmm.
All right, you can start reading Remark 2.
All right. Sorry. Remark 2. The claim that the finite is an idealization defines idealism. The idealism of philosophy consists in nothing else than in the recognition that the finite is not truly inexistent. Every philosophy is essentially idealism, or at least has idealism for its principle, and the question then is only how far this principle is carried out. This applies to philosophy just as much as to religion, for religion also, no less than philosophy, will not admit finitude as a true being, an ultimate, an absolute, or as something non-posited, uncreated, eternal. The opposition between idealistic and realistic philosophy is therefore without meaning. A philosophy that attributes to finite existence, as such, true, ultimate, absolute being, does not deserve the name of philosophy. The principles of ancient as well as more recent philosophies, whether water, matter, or atoms, are universals, idealizations, not things as given immediately, that is, in sensuous singularity. Not even the water of Thales is that, for, although also empirical water, it is besides that the in itself or essence of all other things, and these things do not stand on their own, self-grounded, but are posited on the basis of an other, of water. That is, they are idealized. And thus calling the principle or the universal as an idealization, as we have just done, and the concept, the idea, spirit, deserve the name even more, and in saying then that the singular things of the senses are idealizations in principle, or in their concept, and even more so when sublated in the spirit, we must note, in passing, the same double-sidedness that transpired in the infinite, namely that an idealization is on the one hand something more concrete, a true existent, but on the other hand, that its moments are no less idealizations sublated in it. In fact, however, there is only one concrete whole from which the moments are inseparable.
Alright.
Alright, yeah.
So, when he says, a philosophy that attributes to finite existence as such true ultimate absolute being does not deserve the name of philosophy. I have to agree there, and I think he's meaning it in a common sense way, not in this, not in like a real philosophical sense, because there's a philosophical way where you could say, okay, the only things that exist are finite things. And obviously we've already seen, through the logic, the prior section on finitude, that this itself is an infinitization of finitude. Whether you intend it or not, you've actually done it. You've made the finite infinite by claiming that it is all that there is. But I think by what he says by finite existence here, it's literally, it's like Hume. It's literally that kind of thing in which you say, well, look, everything's just passing. The only things that are, everything's finite, and finite not in even the enduring finite sense. It's not talking about the category of finite, but it's literally talking about like the finite things we experience. That's reality. Well, that's garbage. That's not true, because the moment you even said what you said, it's already gone. So it's just as much untruth by your own standard. If things are only as they pass away, well, whatever you say has already passed away. It's itself untrue. So, doesn't deserve the name of philosophy. Yeah. Indeed, it has no value whatsoever. And the other things, the examples that he gives, I think are just spot on. Doesn't matter if you're talking about matter. It doesn't matter if you're talking about atoms. If you're talking about so-called physicalism, every single philosophy is idealism de facto. Because you're talking about ideas, you're talking about the essence of things, you're talking about universal structures. And people can cry about it, until God knows the when, but it's true, and I think Hegel's like damn right about that. There's also lots to be said about what actually counts as philosophy, because there are philosophies which by Hegel's own criterion, will not count as philosophy. And I agree, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think that demeans things in that sense. In the text chat, oh shit, what did you realize?
Huh?
Did you have an epiphany? Yeah, it's common sense. Like, it's like, if you ever notice, like, every once in a while I post on Lefty Pool, like, saying this, so, like, I appear on post less, but, like, we both have said this for, like, a long time, for, like, since I found that quote. I'm like, oh god, it's true. Like, it's true. It's all idealism in the end. Like, it doesn't matter what you call it.
Mm.
Yeah, and so, like, people like, how is, like, people get mad that you say, like, material, like, you'll go into Marxist and, like, like, calling materialism idealism, and you come in like, yeah, what about it? It is.
Yeah.
And the great thing, though, it's not like in this stupid abstract sense, like materialism, in which, like, they claim, oh, everything's materialism, like, your thoughts are material, your feelings are material. It's not in this stupid sense of, like, oh, well, I just defined everything to be materialism, therefore, haha, everything's material. No, like, this has a very strict sense of, like, defined idealism, and it still covers everything. So it just happens to be that everything is in fact idealism in a sense.
But when you talk about materialism in that sense, it becomes a meaningless term.
Yeah, because materialism is, it's one concept of ideal, and one ideal concept, and it has to have a specific, more restricted meaning.
All right, should I go on?
Sorry, I wanted to say one more thing.
Okay.
Wanted to comment on where he says, someone says, I don't think Marx even called himself materialist. Nah, he did. I mean, like, it's understandable why. Yeah, he did. It's part of it's a reaction. It was a sort of like a way to distance himself from the metaphysical, theological Hegelians at the time. So, the materialism was all the rage. Yeah, in the 1844 manuscripts, he talks about, well, it probably would make sense to just call it naturalism instead, because, he's not, he knows he's not talking about, like, matter as substance, which is what most other people who call themselves materialists are talking about. But he still called himself materialist, just to distance himself away from theology and idealism of the day. So I wanted to comment where he says, in thus calling the principle as universal and idealization, as we have just done, and in saying then that the singular things of the senses are idealizations in principle, or in their concept, and even more so when sublated in the spirit. So it's important there, I think, to note that idealization here has to do with concepts. That when we say that the truth of things, in saying that then that the singular things of the senses are idealizations in principle, the truth of things, the essence of things are, guess what? Things which are these abstract concepts that we have made. Abstract, not in the usual. Well, goddamn, it's so hard to talk about this because it's abstract in the usual sense, but it's not as well. It is abstract in that it's literally abstracted from but it's not abstract in that it's like vague, it's very concrete. And he says, we must note in passing the same double-sidedness transpired in the infinite, namely that an idealization is on the one hand something concrete, a true existent, but on the other hand that its moments are no less idealizations sublated in it. In fact, however, there is only one concrete whole from which the moments are inseparable. So this is important, I think. One, because he said it, idealizations is on the one hand something concrete, a true existent. So this takes care of the charge that Hegel's a Platonist who believes there are abstract ideas out there, and things here, some are like shadows of like these ideas floating somewhere. There's no such thing as abstract ideas in Hegel. They don't exist anywhere else. The things you see here existent are the ideas as far as Hegel cares. But then he continues on to say that there's a double-sidedness to this, in which just as it applies to one side, it's got to apply to the other. If these abstract, these universal concepts, these essences are abstractions from our everyday concreteness is likewise an abstraction from these abstracted concepts, because they are moments. They actually don't exist in themselves. Once we actually inquire into what their actual reality is, what their actual essential being is, what do we find except these universal concepts which subsume them? So the concrete individuals are themselves ideal because they too are abstractions. They can't exist on their own. To think that they exist on their own is indeed to make the to make the error of abstraction. Just as it's an error to believe that ideas exist somewhere free floating out there, it's an error to make to believe that individual concrete things just exist right here in their immediacy. We know that's not true. Just regular empirical science, the stuff everybody believes in and loves, proves this without beyond a shadow of a doubt, that things aren't immediately what you see. The reality is something that goes beyond them. It's something that unifies them beyond themselves. Did I make that more or less understandable, Joshua? I mean, I might as well give this example. I've been trying to write a blog and finish it out on this, and the example I want to give is like, say, a cow. You walk up to a cow and you're like, I got a cow in front of me. And the reality of that cow is that a cow is obviously much more than the immediate cow that you have before you. Cows don't just plop into existence, fully adults, fully self-maintained, out in the middle of nowhere. Cows have a certain set of conditions in which they must exist in. They don't exist abstracted from those. They need oxygen, they need grass, they need dirt, they need earth, they need gravity, they need sun. They have a life cycle. They're born, they eat, they grow, they reproduce. So all of that is part of the reality of a cow. And if you think that a cow is just the immediate cow that you have before you, you literally are looking at an idealization and an abstraction. Cows can be tipped. Yes, they can. Though I don't think that's part of their essential concept, but it's definitely a contingent thing that can happen. Alright, so just gonna wait on Hyperion to come back. I really like this section. I mean, it's a nice change of pace and change of difficulty, because after like the slog we've been through for like the denseness of this last 2 chapters, these comments are just like, well, especially the whole last section on infinity was just so clear. It boggles my mind how people do not understand it. But that's probably because we've actually done the work that makes this seem so crystal clear, I suppose. So what do you think, Josh? You want to do like chapter 3? You want to continue on to that? Because that was my hope that we'd at least make it to the end of chapter 3, because I think chapter 3 is at least fleshes out the first full iterations of the general concept. Like while we won't have like the explicit details of how the concept works as it does at the end of the logic, we will have, I think, pretty much the basic ground structure of it, which is pretty powerful nonetheless. And I think even once you have this much, there's a lot of the Hegelian literature that you can read, and you'll find yourself not very lost. You can usually just rely on these sets, these first 3 chapters to kind of understand a version of what they're talking about.
I'm back. Sorry about that. I got takeout and the guy wanted to talk for a moment. I didn't want to be rude. Where are we?
Same place, bottom of page 124. By an idealization.
Oh, you want me to go ahead?
Well, you started it, you finish it,
Sure.
buddy.
All right. By an idealization is normally meant the form of representation. Whatever is in any of my representations, whether in my concept, the concept, the idea, the imagination, and so forth, goes by the name of idealization, so that the idealized stands, in general, also for imaginary constructs. For representations that are not only distinguished from anything real, but should be essentially not be taken as real. In point of fact, spirit is above all the true idealist. In spirit, even as spirit senses and represents, but still more as it thinks and conceptualizes, the content is not real existence, as so called. In the simplicity of the I, any such external being is only sublated. It is for me. It is in me idealized. This subjective idealism, whether it is the unconscious idealism of consciousness in general or is consciously declared and installed as principle, extends only to the form of representation, according to which a content is mine. In the systematized idealism of subjectivity, the form is declared to be the only true form, one that excludes the form of the objectivity or reality of that content, of its external existence. Such an idealism is formal, since it does not take into consideration the content of representation or thought, and therefore does not go past its finitude. Nothing is lost by this idealism, both because the reality of this finite content, the existence filled with finitude, is retained, and because, if one abstracts from it, in itself nothing of much consequence is to be made of it. Nor is anything gained by it, for the same reason that nothing is lost, since the I remains representation, spirit still filled with the same content of finitude. The opposition of the forms of subjectivity and objectivity is, of course, itself one of finitudes. But the content, as taken up in sensation, intuition, or also in the more abstract element of representation and thought, contains such finitudes in full, and these...
Anyways, let's finish this. We're almost to the end of chapter 2.
Okay, did you read any more?
No.
Oh. Okay. Okay, the opposition of the forms of subjectivity and objectivity is, of course, itself one of finitudes. But the content, as taken up in sensation, intuition, or also in the more abstract element of representation and thought, contains such finitudes in full, and these, by the exclusion of that one mode of finitude alone, of the form of subjective and objective, are still not done away with, and even less have they fallen off on their own. Well,
Oh, well,
I was literally on the sentence at the end.
wow, that was an abrupt end.
Yeah. Well, that's chapter 2.
So yeah, well, I mean, I definitely learned this rereading. And obviously, because last time we literally stopped at infinity and I didn't read any further.
Yeah.
Well, now I don't have the excuse of, well, I'm waiting to finish chapter 2 to finally redo my outline of chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
The real question is, though, Joshua, are you seeing the dialectics yet? Like, has it yet happened to you that, you're reading something, or you're listening to something, or you're watching something, you're like, wait a minute, it's a contradiction right there. Yeah, it happens, and like the more like you do this, like the easier it starts to get because you start getting the hang of the flow. But you never like quite get comfortable with the flow because the flow will always change. So like now that we've gotten good with existence, I'm curious at how being for itself is going to work. But yeah, I want to definitely go through and finish chapter 3, and we'll leave it there after that. I think it'll be a good break if we ever desire to continue it later on. So, right, we'll leave that here today. Thank you for coming. See you next time.